It's
Welcome, students. I hope you are able to watch this recording since you're not here in person, but we look forward to sharing this information with you anyhow. So with that, Chelsea, would you like to give some acknowledgements for this session? Oh,
yes, and
hold
I'm
on.
still not able to, share the screen. So this is topic 1, domestic extremism, post-January 6th. We have a number of sponsors who have made this 2021 Youth Security Forum possible that we just want to thank at the outset. The Reno Sparks Chamber of Commerce, Mission Support and Test Services, who manage the Nevada National Security Site, Ted Morse, Larry Struve, and Norman Jan Ziomek. Thank you so much for your support at these events.
Excellent. So we are here today with Dr. Elizabeth Yates from the START Center at the University of Maryland. And since Chelsea and I seem to be the students today, we are going to ask you some follow-on questions, Dr. Yates, about your very helpful and informative intro video that you gave us about domestic extremism. And in particular, we'll let you pick it up from there and talk to us a little bit about maybe 3 things: the history, sort of how the history culminated in domestic extremism to get us to the point that the insurrection happened on January 6th, and where you see the trends and patterns going from this point. And then a little bit about how you got into this business and why you were drawn to this field.
Sure. Okay. Those are a lot. So I'll try to keep my answers relatively short for each. So I think, I guess maybe I'll start with the personal history before we dive into the substantive questions here. I'm a sociologist, which means that I study the way that society influences individuals and the way that individuals are influenced by society. So sociologists do all kinds of things. They study everything from whether or not people might get the vaccine, to how people experience prison, to domestic extremism like me now. So I was really interested in research. There are a bunch of different ways. If you're interested in public policy, you might go into being in government directly or be an advocate. And I really wanted to do research and sort of be in the data and in the events and thinking about this all the time. So I got a PhD and focused on social movement organizing, which is sort of looking at, it's kind of a unique approach to domestic extremism and to extremism generally, but I studied the way that people become involved in organizations and do anything from mobilize protests to foment revolutions to terrorist attacks, that kind of thing. So and then I focused especially on the right wing. So that's how I wound up at START. But I do want to talk a little bit. I think I'm glad you asked about the history. I think in order to understand January 6th, you do have to think about especially the last, 5 or 6 years. And a few things have happened. One is that we've had a growth of disinformation. So that's come from a number of channels. It's come from people in power and, including elected officials, and narratives advanced by the former president, as well as by, foreign actors and that kind of thing. And so the spread of disinformation suggesting that, for example, that there was enormous fraud in the election that was completely, out of the range of what we typically see in elections, and that the results were thus inaccurate, that kind of thing. That was propagated all over the place, and that was not true, but was cited and repeated enough times that a lot of people really believed that it was true. So that growth of disinformation, that was really sort of the recent, after the election, but it had been growing over the last few years. And it was one product of the process of partisan polarization. And that's a political science term that basically means as people start to identify more and more strongly with different partisanship, and to become more and more radical on either end, and to have less and less in common with one another. So you've got Democrats believing one thing and Republicans believing one thing and not really having much agreement. Whereas previously you had Republicans and Democrats, would have different ideas, but they would have a lot of overlap, and you would have divisions based on geography or, other things, other divisions. But, increasingly we've seen that Democrats start to be more similar to each other and more different from Republicans, and Republicans start to be more similar. And so they become less trusting of each other, right? I think I saw a study recently that said that people reported that in some measure that they would be unhappy if their child were to marry someone of a different political affiliation, right? And that's not something we've seen in the last few generations, right? That's a new development. So that creation of distrust is really problematic, because it does mean that people are consuming news sources, maybe only from a limited place where they trust this kinds of news source and not others. And, to be clear, this has been an especial problem on the right recently, where there have been a number of news sources that have just not been responsible in reporting. And so that has created this situation in which, people are getting news sources from sources that might not have the fact checking or or the credibility, and everyone's in their own echo chambers and not in the same place. So there's not like a shared understanding of reality, and that's a real problem. And so that's something that had been happening for a while. And so by the time you had the election had occurred and the results were becoming manifest in the presidency of Biden, there were a number of people who really thought that democracy was being undermined and being overturned. And so they viewed the installation of President Biden as an existential threat. They felt like democracy, like a revolution was already happening, like a war was already occurring. They felt like this was the moment in which, their democracy was being taken away from them. And so we do see an extremism that when you have those kinds of views, when you perceive something as an existential threat, the kind of threat that's going to destroy your way of life and the world as you know it, that is the kind of thing that forces you to act, because you don't feel like you have much to lose, right? You feel like you're very compelled to act. And so, we had this really big event where a number of people felt that way. And I think that, we're seeing a huge number of prosecutions, right? I think we've seen over 400, 440, something like that at this point. There's a few more every day trickle in. And so we'll see how that goes. And I think the prosecution of those cases will impact what we see moving forward. So if those are, taken seriously and it is demonstrated that, there is no basis in these ideas, and that these were considered, to some extent crimes, against democracy, that kind of thing, then that will have an impact and show people, I think, that, this is well outside of the bounds of legal behavior and such. So we'll see how those move forward. But I think a few things that we will see, that we have seen, that we'll continue to see in terms of, sort of trends and where this is going, is, the continuing partisanship. And in terms of extremism, we continue to see crimes targeting who perceive to be political opposition. So for a long time, white supremacists and anti-government extremists targeted the government, the federal government, and they targeted people of color. They targeted African Americans and Jewish people, religious minorities, people of color, that kind of thing. And we still certainly see that. That has not gone away, unfortunately. But we're also seeing a growth of attacks on people they just associate with the left, no matter what their race or anything. So, anyone that does not believe that former President Trump is president, or anyone that identifies on the left, who is identified as Antifa or not, they'll call them Antifa, they'll call them communists, and they'll target them that way. So that is something that we've seen increasingly, and actually has culminated in a number of sort of street fights between leftists and sort of hard nationalist right-wingers, especially, and that's the kind of thing, frankly, that actually was much more common in Europe and that we haven't seen in the US in a long time. So that's something we'll continue to see. I think we'll continue to see the growth of conspiracy theories. Unfortunately, there are just a number of places where this is coming from. The trust in shared institutions and shared media sources has eroded so much that people are believing things from all kinds of sources, just all kinds of places. I think, if you don't Google something and check out what the background of a source is before you post it to Facebook, or I'm sure you guys can use Facebook. I know that's like for older people, sure. But
we asked that in
TikTok,
the last session.
What are they? Are they using
In the
TikTok?
last-
Are they using Facebook?
No, it was Instagram and Snapchat.
Yeah, I mean, my grandma's on Facebook, so I know you guys aren't on Facebook. Like, that's too much. Yeah. So, people aren't fact checking that, all kinds of things circulate. And again, when people start to believe elements of conspiracy theories, if you, go down the rabbit holes, as they say, then, you might start to think that you are facing an existential threat, and you really start to perceive people as enemies because they disagree with you, or because they believe something differently, or they have a different lifestyle. That really does start to happen, unfortunately. So that was long-winded, but I think those are some of the major trends that we're going to continue to see.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Chelsea, you're one of our students for the day.
Well, I was just going to ask you, you used, maybe helpful to get specific. You use the term existential threat a lot when you explain these motivations. Does that just mean like a threat to like life and person, or are there other types of existential threat that motivate this?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So the way that I conceive of the term existential threat in terms of extremism and radicalization is maybe to your person, your own person and your property or something, but it usually is more broad, and it's to maybe your community, the people you identify with, or to your way of life. So, if you have this vision of America as maybe a predominantly white place, maybe exclusively Christian, predominantly Christian, or, rural, there have been anti-urban, movements, that kind of thing. If that's how you conceive of your community and your place, and the world is changing around you, and you feel like that world is going to disappear, then you often will describe it as the defense that you're taking on behalf of other people. That's really common. I mean, when you think about extremists and terrorists in general, one way that they differ from criminals typically is that they do feel, or at least rhetorically, and I think often do feel, that they're fighting on behalf of others, right? They think that they're doing the right thing and they're fighting on behalf of a broader community. So yeah, an existential threat is really something that's, bigger than a threat to yourself personally. Thank you, Chelsea. That's really helpful to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. Norm, you are just joining us. Can you tell me where you're coming from? Are you Reno High?
I think he's muted.
Yeah, you're on mute.
You can also put it in the chat if that's better, and I can read it for
Okay.
you.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Norm, if you would just, when you get a chance, could you tell us where you're joining us from? So I assume you are likely Reno High with Mr. Clark's AP Government, maybe? So let me know in the chat. So with that, we're going to continue. I've got a couple of more questions for you, Dr. Yates. One of the things that we've heard many stories about is the radicalization within military and law enforcement and other government officials. We saw this on January 6th with some, senior military folks and others. Can you talk a little bit about the history of that? And is this something new, or is this something that we've been dealing with for a while but haven't dealt with yet?
Yeah, thanks. It's not new. It is something we've been dealing with for a while, and there have been recurring efforts by the federal government and police agencies and other agencies to deal with this. We have seen it in waves. I know there's a historian who's talked a lot about white supremacist anti-government extremism among veterans, and it's a lot of veterans. I should start by saying this is a tiny percentage of there. We see in some data, we see an overrepresentation of military veterans in groups, but sometimes it's meaning there are sometimes it's sort of consistent with the percent of the population. So it's not that there necessarily are many more military veterans in extremism than, you know, in the population overall, but they might play outsized roles. So they might play really important roles because they have the background and the training to be effective in combat, in emergency preparation, with weaponry, that kind of thing. So they've long been recruited into these roles, veterans into these kinds of organizations. And I think that there is historically been some discussion of the way that, veterans people who, served the US military and served their country came home feeling, that they, disenchanted with their experience in the United States. And so, they, like I said before, if they felt like the world that they had gone to combat to prevent or to protect was not the world that they came home to, that they were disappointed, they felt like the federal government was not representing them and their interests, then they turned against it. And that was something that Kathleen Ballou, who's a historian, documented in a recent book that is, you guys are nodding, that's really great. And yeah, what she says is something, these people came home from Vietnam and the country had turned much more liberal. People were calling them, war criminals and not supporting the war, and they felt really rejected. And a lot of them had been, had grown up in a country, they were white and had grown up in an incredibly racist country, and, were not comfortable with the advances of racial equality and were turned off by the idea that the federal government was going to help reintegrate or to integrate, and to advance racial equality. So that kind of rejection historically, has, we think has become a component in the veteran involvement in extremism. I will say that, we struggle to know to what extent it's a problem right now, because, this information is often not public. So we know, our data shows that I think it's maybe 23%, we'll look at it, of far-right extremists have a veteran background, and that's pretty high. But that's also kind of easy information to get about an extremist if they have it, so it's usually public information. So, it's not something we know enough about, and we certainly need more resources and time spent on it. But it's very dangerous, right? Because especially, in policing, these are people who have the capacity to do harm. And then especially as they are the people doing the policing, if they have racist ideas or anti-government ideas, it calls into question what they're doing in their roles, power in the US, right? Are they treating Black and white people, equally? Are they protecting citizens equally? That kind of thing. So it's a frankly a very big concern.
I'm glad to hear you talk about that, because, and for the students, if you can withstand some pretty in-depth history, yes, Kathleen Ballou's book, Bring the War Home, is a startling expose at looking at the issue of radicalization in the military. And I think we're seeing for the first time, the military actually address this issue under Secretary Austin. So that's a lot different than what we've seen in the past. But you're right, they don't have the records, they don't have the numbers, and obviously this is not a new issue there. Which brings me to a second point, which is similar. The concept of conspiracy theories, QAnon. We think this is brand new, but it seems like we're been around this block before. Could you talk a little bit more about how that feeds into the extremism world, and is it new, and what are we doing about it?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways there's nothing new under the sun, right? And I know that's hard for young people to think about. It happens sometimes. I feel like that. So the basic foundation of the QAnon beliefs are that there is a satanic cult of people who are, and this is really horrible to say out loud, I'm sorry, it's kind of graphic, but that are torturing children basically in order to drink their blood and live forever. That's honestly the base belief. And that is, it has, and it's in QAnon now, there's this belief that there is a like some kind of person with military background and insider intelligence knowledge that's trying to expose this and using Donald Trump as a force to try to expose this and all the people involved, right? And so the belief is that it's a huge number of political elites are involved, and Hollywood celebrities and Tom Hanks, Hillary Clinton, and anyone. And so it has caused, people, if you really believe this and you think that there's just like a child trafficking ring, people have, felt that that is a huge threat and have tried to, enter institutions where they think that's occurring and stop them, or try to hurt people that they think are involved in this. And, there's just no basis in reality for this, right? This is just like a complete conspiracy theory. And so it's new in the sense that the actors that are sort of featured, right, like Donald Trump or others, or, General Flynn, some of these sort of central actors that are seen as the protagonists, the heroes here are, recently new on the political scene. But these ideas that there is an elite cabal of individuals who are controlling everything and are doing the worst, thing in humanity, torturing children, right? Those ideas have been circulating for a long time, and often they're anti-Semitic. So this cabal, this term is often used to refer basically to Jewish people, and this has happened for hundreds of years. There have been texts that have circulated in Europe and in the United States and around the world suggesting that Jewish people are controlling everything, and that they control business, they control politics, and that they're trying to get Christian children to drink their blood. And this has been cited in all kinds of violent attacks, these kinds of ideas. So, it's kind of I would say, regurgitation of some of the same ideas. But it is, it does vary. It's a new manifestation of it. And through social media, it's become very widespread.
And it's good to know that it's been going on for a long time. It's bad to know that it's been going on for a long time and we haven't been able to effectively counter this in the past. Chelsea, you probably have a few more questions.
I do. Yeah. Talking about, we had a session earlier today. Well, two sessions actually. One talking about cybersecurity and one talking about Myanmar and what happened there. And actually, to some extent, disinformation came up in both of them. And I think when I think about misinformation and disinformation, I think about it as like a US phenomenon. But it seems kind of clear that that's not so. Can you say anything about like a worldwide change in how that is used or how it spreads, and what we might do like as a global society to combat that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that as just the world has become more transnational in general, so like regular people like us, maybe travel more, you might read news sources, we are on the same social media networks that people from all over the world are on. It makes all this kinds of communication, the good and the bad, more easy, right, or easier and more frequent. So, I think that's why generally we have seen the growth of this misinformation, disinformation across international lines. With respect to extremism, I think that's one reason why you've seen a growth in the transnationalization, especially of right-wing extremism. But we've also seen some ideological transformations that have made right-wing extremists in the US feel like they are allies with right-wing extremists in Europe, especially. So xenophobia, so like anti-immigrant sentiment, has become a bigger, our data shows it's become a bigger and bigger concern for white supremacists in the United States. And so that has always sort of been the central focus of white supremacists in Western Europe. And so they have sort of built relationships based on that, right? They're especially opposed to Muslim refugee resettlement and those kinds of things. So they've built those relationships, which means that as they have those relationships, they're on social media networks and such, they share information and misinformation and disinformation. So especially there were a lot of examples around this, especially during the beginning of the pandemic, when narratives about maybe even the US government as involved in trying to use the coronavirus as a way to weaken the United States, those kinds of things would be shared across international borders, right? So it would pick up on the local narratives like, oh, some countries have this perception, or some communities in those countries have this perception of the US as this big hegemonic power or an imperial power or something like that. And they would build on that local narrative and and, incorporate it into misinformation, disinformation about COVID, right? So the idea that masks are just like a tool to keep people sick and to stop people from breathing and to keep their minds weak, to like take over mind control, for like zombies or whatever, these kinds of things on the internet in 2020. Yeah, those definitely had, international dimensions, and you could see them cycle through, because they're not going through gatekeepers, right? They're not going from like the publisher of a newspaper in England to the publisher of a newspaper in the UK. In the US. They're going straight from user to user. So yeah.
Given this sort of like international feedback loop where, people are sharing information directly with each other, or misinformation rather directly with each other, it seems like one of the only strategies we've really seen people like companies, I guess, use is like flagging misinformation on social media platforms and things like that. That seems like it's not very effective in an ecosystem like that.
I mean, I don't think we know for sure to what extent it's been effective. I think we've seen that it has not been fully effective for sure, because they flagged a ton of information, and then actually people started to use that, right? They would post something. They would post some kind of information in order to get the flag and then make a meme out of it, right? This is how culture works. Like, we take things and we incorporate them, and we make jokes about them. And so, yeah, no, that wasn't fully effective for sure. I think certainly deplatforming people when they have been spreading misinformation and it's documented, and taking that seriously and saying, hey, we're responsible for our content here to some extent, has been effective. I know that there are concerns about that, the idea being that, like, if you deplatform extremists, then they might all go to one small space and then get even more extreme there. But I think what we've seen in terms of the Capitol riots and the spread of QAnon is that when they're on these mainstream spaces, they are spreading like rapid fire through mainstream issues, right? So with QAnon, you saw people who are interested in like yoga and like health, right? Things that are really common and really normal to care about, that people would use those kinds of channels and blogs and groups to spread misinformation, because people who were influencers that way could see that that would boost their presence. So they could see that, if people started, if they attached their like wellness blog, if they attached some information about like child trafficking related to QAnon, that was going to bump their numbers. And so they had that incentive to do it. So, I think deplatforming is also an option that does work. And but it's always often reactive, right? It's like companies will try to take down that after it's already happened, once they've already sort of permeated these mainstream networks. So
yeah.
So pulling that thread a little bit, Dr. Yates, you're in this study in the center that is studies of terrorism and responses to terrorism. What responses have worked, or have you looked at what responses work in order to tamp down the level of extremism that we're seeing in society today? Or is this a cyclic thing that we just go through and bottom out somewhere and start recovering? What happens next? Because obviously we've been through periods of extremism in the past, and is there hope for the future?
So I certainly think there's hope for the future. I think that the idea that it'll sort of bottom out and dissipate on its own is not accurate. That's, I think, and I'm glad you brought it up, because that is sort of a problematic view. I think people will say, oh, it'll go away. Yeah, we've seen periods of this. People will stop believing this stuff. And I think that sort of ignores the work that people were doing to counter it, right? Like these aren't just sort of waves that happen. It's not like bias just sort of disappears or prejudice sort of disappears. People have to really proactively challenge it. And so I think that it does require people proactively challenging these ideas and identifying them as marginal or as inaccurate, and marginalizing them and making it clear that, they don't have basis. So it requires building trust in institutions. It requires building back up shared faith in publications and in sources of information. It requires a lot of proactive work that way. And that's hard to say. What do you do on an individual level? Yeah, you might do things like check information before you post it, or talk to your family and friends who, express views that, frankly, are not based in reality, those kinds of individual things. But, on a broader level, it does require leadership in institutions and in companies and wherever else exists to be proactive. This is not just going to go away, and maybe it's even less likely just to quote unquote go away now than ever before, given the fact that the internet has created these, silos and independent networks that don't have gatekeepers and such, that it might be even more less likely to disappear on its own than it ever was.
Do you see in the data sets that you monitor like patterns and pathways out of extremism, like effective outreach or anything like that?
So I think that data in terms of like reactions to those kinds of programs is still coming, because those programs are really new. So Europe has been doing this for a long time. They have some data on it, but even there it's pretty new. They're brand new to the US. We don't have a national counter extremism policy. We don't have anything like that. We don't have programs. We don't have funding. We don't have funding for counselors to have specialization in this field and to help people. There are a couple of basically private groups that have tried to do it. And so, we don't have a ton of data on that. We have a little bit of data looking at case studies, basically, to show that, to some extent, people kind of get burnt out individually. People get burnt out. If you are sort of living this extremist lifestyle, if you're in like a skinhead gang, it's just really exhausting. You're just like drinking and partying, and you're marginalized from society, and you're very violent, and you're worried about your safety, and you're feeling on edge all the time. But that's a pretty extreme group, right? Like, you can understand, I think, how living in that kind of group would kind of get you burnt out, right? If you are able to do your job and live your life and continue believing, ideas without sort of acting on them, and, you can live in that space for a long time. But the burnout does happen. People do get just burnt out from feeling this constant existential threat, the anxiety and the anger that it creates. So that's one. But again, that's an individual level. That's not really how groups disappear, right? Because more people come and replace them. But yeah, I mean, what we can see is that it's different for different individuals, right? So we did one study looking at people who disengaged and didn't disengage. And we saw that there were a couple of different groups. There was one group where the people who had been to prison, they had difficulty in employment and education, and they needed help finding opportunities to replace, to help stabilize their lives so that they could focus on things outside of their involvement in extremism. And that allowed them to sort of open back up to the world, re-engage in society, or pro-socially, find pro-social values and sort of re-engage in society normally. And so that was one group. The other were people who maybe had more stable backgrounds, they had more education, and they had attained some kind of influence in these groups. So they were getting all of this really sort of high status out of being maybe a leader in these groups and being, considered a thought leader in the world of extremism, right? And those people needed something more to get out. They needed leadership opportunities outside of extremism. They needed to be taken seriously and to have a channel for their ideas, and not their ideas, but their efforts to improve the world. As we said before, these are a lot of people who consider themselves working on behalf of the communities or whatever. They needed another outlet for that. So unfortunately, there's not a one size fits all program that's going to work anywhere. But it takes resources, it takes activity. These are all things that really just require proactive engagement and leadership. Frankly, there's not an easy solution. Yeah.
You mentioned, and I just realized that as we're talking about extremist groups, we haven't really identified who these groups are. And do they work together? Because we've heard the phrase that the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, we've got neo-Nazi groups, you have the Prepper Society, all these entities. Who are they, A, and B, and do they work together? Do they work separately? What's the intersection? How do they function?
Yeah, so it really depends from group to group. Some of them are really broad networks that people might affiliate with just by being in an online, social space. In some cases, that online social space can become very real, as you youth probably all know your online lives are a part of your real life.
Especially
And
this
so
year.
yeah, well, oh my gosh, of course. Yeah. So like, as you maybe through gaming sites or whatever, people make real friendships and stuff online. So I don't want to, suggest that that's not, genuine, really close contact, but to some extent they are sort of more broad, right? So they're called decentralized. They don't have really strong leadership. It's like people might follow them on social media or, enter into chat rooms and that kind of thing. And other ones have like group application processes where you submit an application, you get yourself a member and get yourself a little badge. So like, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, those are like group members. And there are people who are more and less affiliated, but there is actual membership in those groups. Some of the militia groups are, a handful of guys out in the field preparing for a war, and then they meet up with guys from other states. We saw this with this sort of Boogaloo movement, which is an anti-government network of people who see a civil war coming and want to, I think I talked about accelerationism in my previous chat. So they often will meet each other for the first time at a protest or at an event. And that's a little bit more diffuse. So there really is a variety. Those, some of them have different ideologies, but they do come together when they share specific ideas or specific enemies or targets. So when there are big events like the Capitol riots, like there was a gun rights rally, like the Charlottesville rally in 2017, these are all moments when these groups with different ideologies, some of them might be anti-government and, really not involved in racist activities or anti-Semitic activities or beliefs. There might be some that are explicitly white nationalist, white separatist, white supremacist. These groups do come together in certain instances when, say, they want to target the federal government. And they use these events as opportunities that might get a much broader population. They use it as an opportunity to network with each other, to network with new recruits, to mainstream their ideas, to make them look normal, because look, there's this huge crowd of people. They're just one of us. We're all patriots, that kind of thing. So these events really have that radicalizing effect. And I think we certainly saw the Capitol riot as an example of that. But yeah, sometimes they're operating in completely different spaces. And that's actually when you see extremism being less present, it's, there's probably less interaction that way.
Yeah, and sometimes it gets a bit confusing. You can understand when there's one group that's, QAnon conspiracy theory on one side, and there's Boogaloo Boys who are, sort of, anarchist group or anti-government group on the other side. And then there are groups, that are hardcore, neo-Nazi or racist organizations. It's a little hard from the outside to understand what draws them together.
Mm-hmm. So
for events like January 6th.
Yeah, that's a good question. So if there were people who came on January 6th with divergent goals, right? So there were people who came, we have some evidence that they came because they wanted to disrupt the democratic process and prevent President Biden from being inaugurated, not inaugurated that day, but for the certification, right, of the congressional results. And they had different reasons for that. Some of them came because, they had just been Trump supporters who really felt like the election was stolen, democracy was crumbling, and they were going to stop that and, restore democracy. There were others who believed that the entire system of democracy, of capitalism, of the electoral system in general is completely corrupt, is completely, has no value. And so they might not be supporters of President Trump, but they just wanted to see chaos, and they wanted to use this opportunity to disrupt the system, which is, a term that a lot of extremists use just basically to mean the government, the social, political, economic systems. So, there are some people from the base. I think there was a quote of one of the guys saying, there'll be enough. Well, that might have been a different event. I'm sorry, but using this as an opportunity, they just may or not have anything to do with Donald Trump. QAnon supporters, definitely believe that they were trying to restore Trump to the presidency, or maintain Trump in the presidency. So again, like they may have had more narrow, or they may have had more broad ideas. And so, yeah, I think a lot of these groups will say, oh my gosh, we have nothing to do with neo-Nazis or racists or anything like that. But when they shared a belief that the system was not working, that they were facing an existential threat, and that's sort of what brought them together that way.
Interesting. Yeah, it's sometimes baffling from the outside if you can't understand why. They make for strange bedfellows, let's put it that way.
That certainly can happen. Yeah. I mean, actually,
Yeah.
you see that at for example, like Black Lives Matter protests. We've seen
True.
boogaloo groups, some of whom are, a lot of that movement, the origins of that movement come from white supremacism. So you see some of these groups who are explicit white supremacists, many of them are, a lot of them are. And then you see others that, are more sort of libertarian. And so the white supremacists sort of oppose the evolution of the Black Lives Matter movement because they see it as, supporting Black people generally. So they oppose it. And they were even going to these to try to make BLM look bad, right? So to pose as BLM protesters. But there were some who are, anti-government extremists and feel like, who oppose the police, oppose police actions in some circumstances, and were there on some level to support BLM protesters. And so sometimes they're faking it and sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's genuine, and it can be, again, these diffuse networks. It's not like you have to like sign a thing saying you agree all this stuff, right? So it can definitely be confusing, and researchers have been on their toes with that one, I'd say.
Yes, more data is needed, I'm sure. Chelsea, do you have a last question?
Yeah, I guess I too, and both are short. Do you think that we'll see another January 6th style event maybe at the next election, or is that something that seems likely?
I don't think that we're likely to see that unfold that way, because I think that the security will be operationalized much more effectively. That's my hope. I think that a lot of people are taking this very seriously, and that I hope that we will have better apparatus to avoid that. I don't think that the sentiment necessarily will disappear in future elections. I don't know, but I don't think we're likely to see anything quite like that for a while. But it could, I think people might ask, might that happen locally, right? State elections, that kind of thing. We remember the attack on the Michigan governor,
Right.
that kind of thing. I think we certainly will continue to see events that echo the Capitol riots.
I also wanted to ask, I think maybe just helpful for students who are thinking about college majors or careers. Can you talk at a high level about the types of tools that you use to study this big problem that you study? I assume there's statistics, social network analysis, what kinds of things?
Yeah, so I would definitely recommend that everyone force themselves to take statistics in college, even if you're like, I'm not a numbers person, I don't know. Look, you can handle statistics. It might be really hard. I TA'd for statistics for undergrads at one point, and some people really struggle, but if you put the time in, the thing about statistics is it is critical to understanding so many things. Like, how can you understand the pandemic without understanding statistics, right? I really recommend that students take basic applied statistics in college. Maybe audit it, maybe take it pass fail if you're really worried about it, get a tutor. I think it's just worth trying to understand. I really do, especially in terms of trying to understand fake news and misinformation. People will pull out, you'll understand, all of a sudden you'll look at a stat and you'll say, well, that doesn't really mean anything, does it? And you'll be right. So definitely basic applied statistics is something I would recommend. I do use social network analysis also. That's something I did a little bit of training of in grad school, but sort of picked up. But I think that majoring in social sciences in college I was an international relations major, so I took a lot of things. I took political science, sociology, anthropology, government, that kind of thing, economics. Having a foundation in that is really helpful, because it allows you with a background, like a historical background, to understand the foundations of the institutions, right? So if you are really interested in serving in government, why is government shaped this way? Why, what is the role of these different branches, right? Those kinds of things you do need to learn, right? So I think that that's really helpful. and to understand the science aspect of social science. Again, basic applied statistics is one, but also to think, look, there are actually theories that explain why, for example, people might vote one way one year and another way the next, right? It's not perfect. There's always different interpretations, but it's not exactly a big black box. There are ways to study these things. And so I would definitely encourage social science majors in any of those fields. Yeah. And frankly, learning how to read carefully, learning to know what the sources are, like what is a good source and what's not. I remember being in college and being like, I don't know, this is a journal article, I think, like, who knows, it could have been anything. And you just have to learn, like, you'll have to learn who the sources are, who the people, and it's kind of a socialization. And it takes being in the field, reading the materials your professors give you and getting to know, what good sources are. So that's just something you have to learn. And it should be a pleasure to learn on some level.
Yes, and there's a lot more research beyond Wikipedia. Liked you to close, Dr. Yates, in talking a little bit about opportunities for students at START.
Yeah, sure. So when you get into college or graduate school or early career, we do have currently unpaid internships where we have students help build our data. So it's a really good opportunity if you're interested in research or analysis. We have a lot of students go on to work as analysts in the agencies. And even if for them, they might not want to be in academic research one day, but learning how, they say that the sausage is made, learning how data is created is a really useful thing to understand. So we have students basically, we have a code book of all these different factors related to, let's say, an individual extremist. You say, okay, go into open sources, go into court records, social media stuff, news articles, and find, answer all of these questions about this person. And that becomes raw data, right? And that's understanding how that process works is really, really valuable. And so we have students, you get to read about extremists all day. So it's a popular internship. It is competitive, but it is something that I think students really benefit from. And we build a network. We have a network at START. I have former students getting in touch with me all the time. I'm constantly talking to the FBI for background checks. It's a constant. So it is, it can be a really valuable thing for your career. We have a bunch of different ones in our office. Right now, so they've been remote. They're probably we do have students from all over the country come, but they usually come to Maryland or to the DC area and do it in person. We may have some remote options in the future continuing just because it has worked really well. This, last couple semesters, we've had students from all over the country. So we'll see.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing that. And for the students out there, START is a center at the University of Maryland in College Park, Maryland. So we will send links to your teachers so that you have that information as well. So with that, Dr. Yates, thank you very much for joining us. Chelsea, thank you for being student for the day. And I wish all our students well in their next endeavors, and I hope this was informative.